Hello, this is a series of videos based on the Japanese grammar structures introduced in the Wakata course. Starting at Unit 1 and looking at 1.1 TEF forms. Now, many of you will already have looked at TEF forms in the junior course. However, this unit is going to quickly revise that, and we're also going to look at how to use TEF form for adjectives. So first we'll look at what Wakata calls group 1 verbs. Now, other texts and pretty much everyone else, including people in Japan, refer to these as group 2, also known as weak verbs, but for whatever reason, Wakata wants to call them group 1 verbs. So just to be consistent with the course book, I'm just going to call them group 1 verbs in this presentation. So there are two types. Type 1 are the upper level ones. These all have a hiragana rhyming with I before the ru if it's plain form, or the mas in polite form. So for example, imas or kimas or rimas, these all rhyme with I. Type 2 have a character rhyming with e before the ru or the mas. For example, tabemas, miemas, nemas. These all rhyme with e. Putting group 1 verbs into TEF form is pretty simple. We just drop the mas or the ru if it's plain form, and we add te. So you're basically just replacing the mas with te. So mimas becomes mite, dekimas becomes dekite, tabemas becomes tabete. That's it. Really simple rule. Group 2, at least what Wakata calls group 2 and what everyone else calls group 1, these are a bit trickier because there are different rules. So these are the verbs where there's a hiragana that rhymes with u at the end of it if it's plain form, or it rhymes with I before the mas if it is in polite form. So for example, we have kaimas, suwarimas, kakimas, and so on. Now, some of you may not know much about plain forms. Most junior courses don't cover it, but don't freak out because the Wakata course, we will look more into plain forms in Unit 3, so don't worry about it. As many of you will no doubt remember from the junior course, there are different rules depending on what comes before the mas in terms of how to put it into TEF form. And, some teachers like to teach songs and whatever. I'm not very good at that, but you can look back at that if you want. But anyway, the rule here, if the verb has I, chi, or ri before the mas, you drop that hiragana, you drop the mas, and you replace it with a small tsu and te. So for example, imas, to speak. We drop the I, we drop the mas, and we replace it with small tsu and te. So imas becomes ite. Alright? Tachimas, to stand. We drop the chi, we drop the mas, replace it with small tsu and te, tatte. Tachimas becomes tatte. Kaerimas becomes kaete. Kaimas becomes katte. Machimas becomes matte, and so on. For verbs that have ki or gi before the mas, if it's a ki, you drop it and replace it with ite. If it is a gi, you drop that and replace it with ide. Alright, so ki becomes ite, gi becomes ide. Alright, so kikimas becomes kiite, oyogimas becomes oyoide. Now there's a special exception here, which is ikimas, which does not become ite. Alright, that's an exception. We'll look more into that in just a moment for irregular verbs. Now, where there is a ni, bi, or mi before the mas, again, we drop these hiragana characters, we drop the mas, and replace it with nde. For example, asobimas becomes asonde, yomimas becomes yonde, nomimas becomes nonde, and so on. And finally, for this group, if it is a shi before the mas, again, you drop the shi, you drop the mas, and replace it with shite. So hanashimas becomes hanashite, kashimas becomes kashite, naoshimas becomes naoshite, and so on. So these are, of course, the verbs that don't follow any rules. They're just exceptions. And thankfully, there are only 3 of them. So shimas becomes shite, kimas becomes kite, and ikimas becomes ite. Looking at using TEF form on adjectives. So these are the proper adjectives in Japanese, which a lot of junior course books refer to as e-adjectives. So what we do is we take the adjective, we drop the i, and we replace it with kute. So oki becomes okikute, tanoshii becomes tanoshikute, oishii becomes oishikute, and so on. So these are what Wakata refers to as descriptive nouns. We could also call them adjectival nouns, but basically they're really nouns which function as adjectives. A lot of junior coursebooks like to refer to them as na adjectives, but technically speaking, they are actually nouns. Okay, so what we do is we take the descriptive noun and we drop the na and we simply add de. So it's really simple because the words that you see here in black, these are all the base words which are nouns. When we use them to describe something, we use it to function as an adjective, then it becomes an adjectival noun. So you take the word benly, for example. So benly on its own means convenience. If I use it to describe something like benly na, then it becomes convenient. Okay, so to put these into te form, we just put de after the core noun and we don't use the na. So skina becomes skide, benly na becomes benly de, jouzu na becomes jouzu de, and so on. Now, what about just plain old regular nouns? The same rule applies as with descriptive nouns, only that we don't have to deal with na. So you just take the noun and you add de. Okay, so if we have pizza for pizza, it's just pizza de. So other examples are kankokujin becomes kankokujin de, eigo becomes eigo de, omocha becomes omocha de, and so on. 1.2, using te form to conjoin sentences. Here, te form is used to join sentences that present non-contrasting ideas in the same way that the English words and or then are used in conjunction. So for example, okimasu. This will become okite in its plain form. So the example here is kessa 7 ni okite gakko ni ikimashita. This morning I woke up at 7 o'clock and went to school. It is a non-contrasting idea. I wake up, then I go to school. It's something that you would expect. Tabemasu. Hiru gohan o tabete hon o yomimashita. Okay, I ate lunch, then I read a book. It's not something that you would not expect. It's not a conflicting or contrasting idea. 1-3, using ga and keredomo to conjoin sentences. Ga and keredomo are used to join sentences that present contrasting ideas in the same way that English words but or however are used as conjunctions. So this is a bit different. Therefore, we use to join non-contrasting ideas. Ga and keredomo we use to join contrasting ideas. So let's look at some examples. One with the verb, 7 ni okimashita ga asa gohan o tabemasen deshita. Okay, so I woke up at 7 o'clock, but I didn't eat breakfast. All right, so this is a contrasting idea. It's something that's out of the ordinary or something that you would expect. Example with an adjective, 映画は面白かったですけれども、また見たくないです. The movie was interesting, but I don't want to see it again. An example with a descriptive noun, あのおもちゃは高いですが買いたいです. That toy is expensive, but I want to buy it. アナイースさんはフランス人ですけど、双子はアメリカ人です. Anais is French, but her twin is American. So it's a contrasting idea. It's not something that you would expect. 1.4, saying about. And we use this by putting in something before nokoto or nitsuite. Now, before I talk about nokoto, one very common question I always get asked is what's the difference between mono and koto, because they both translate as thing. Now, the word mono or butsu, as it may also be read, means thing in a literal sense, literal physical sense. So for example, tabemono, a thing that you eat, is food. Nomimono, a thing that you drink, is a drink or a beverage, and so on. So the word koto, on the other hand, refers to thing in a more abstract sense. Examples here. Boku wa transformer ga suki desu. I like Transformers. This is a simple, straightforward narrative. This means that you like Transformers, no more, no less. Boku wa transformer no koto ga suki desu. I like Transformers. This means that you like all things Transformers. You like everything about it. You are awesome. So bearing in mind the implied meaning of this sentence, it may also translate as I like everything about Transformers. So more examples here. 試験のことを心配しないでください. Please don't worry about the exam. 日本のことを話しました。I talked about Japan. トランスフォームのことを習いたいです。I want to learn about the Transformers, etc. Looking at について, this means about something with a direct reference or regard to that thing. について can often be synonymously used with のこと. However, it is usually regarded as being more formal. So, for example, 日本の留学について教えてください. Please tell us about your exchange in Japan. あの映画についてどう思いますか? What do you think about that movie? 去年、地球の温暖化について勉強しました. Last year, we learnt about global warming. 1.5, this present simple tense using ています. So, ています can function as either the present continuous tense or the simple present tense. So, here are examples of how it works as the present continuous tense, which simply put is the ing at the end of verbs in English. So, manga o yondeimasu. I am reading manga. Tomodachi to hanashiteimasu. I am talking to a friend. Examples of the simple present tense. Shidori ni sundeimasu. I live in Sydney. Now, in English, we use the present tense live. You could say I'm living in Sydney, but we can also just say I live in Sydney. In Japanese, you need to say I'm living in Sydney. Shirori ni sundeimasu. Because this describes what is the current status. Another example is Itoko wa kekkon shiteimasu. My cousin is married. So we need to use the simple present tense because she's currently in the state of being married. Okay, and there are some other examples which you guys can read for yourselves. 1.6, saying what people and things are called, having a subject followed by toyu, followed by a prepositional object. So the pattern here is to take a subject followed by to, and then followed by you, followed by a prepositional object. So the first example here is transformer, that's our subject. Toyu, our prepositional object here is omocha, followed by o atsumeteimasu. Transformer no toyu omocha o atsumeteimasu. We collect these toys called transformers. Tomodachi to Star Wars toyu eiga o mimashita. I watched a movie called Star Wars with my friend. 1.7, saying that I'll go and do something and then come back. So here we take the verb in its te form and we add kimasu. The first verb in the te form indicates what I'm going out to do. Immediately after this, I say kimasu to assure you that
I'll be back.
So examples here. Ittekimasu. I'm going. But
I'll be back.
Toire ni ittekimasu. I'm going to the toilet. But
I'll be back.
Manga o kattekimasu. I'm going to buy comics. But
I'll be back.
Koe ni aruite kimashita. I went to walk in the park. But
I'll be back.
未来から来たサイボーグと戦ってきます. I'm going to fight with a cyborg from the future.
I'll be back.
Okay, so that concludes the presentation on Unit 1 of Wakata. And I'll hopefully be making more of these videos all the way up to Unit 12. Thanks for watching. I'll be back.